Started. Nick, would you please like to introduce yourself?
Great, thanks, Gunjan. As you said, Nick Aguineras. I'm with Colliers International as a supply chain consultant. I've been in the industry, in the 3PL industry, for the last 13 some odd years, having run facilities, designed and managed networks and operations, as well as from a transportation perspective. So I spent all that time, and now I've been working within the Colliers world to help clients understand the workings of the four walls, the workings of the transportation networks, and ultimately make better real estate decisions. I'm
Hmm.
looking forward to our conversation today. Obviously, supply chain has become front and center in the past 4 months, where everyone now knows, as everyone is going to see, that supply chain is critical to businesses. So we'll be talking about how to handle these disruptions and the opportunities for transformation.
Absolutely. And as you pointed out, Nick, supply chain is such an important piece now for every transformation that we have going on. And if people didn't realize it before, they're probably realizing it now because of COVID. So it would be a very important discussion for somebody in any industry, really.
And,
Um,
and since we have a smaller group, just to the participants, if anyone wants to put on video or wants to unmute themselves or ask questions, feel free to join the conversation throughout.
Absolutely. Yeah, just feel free to either send the questions through chat to everybody or just unmute yourself and speak up. We'd be very happy to have a discussion with you. This isn't one of those webinars where it's just one way information share. We're actually looking to have a discussion with you. One thing I do want to point out is we are recording this session, so just be mindful of that. And so just diving right into it, I want to take a moment to actually explain what Transform This is all about. So there's a lot of focus, as we know, on the customer, typically, right? Before COVID, everything was about customer, and everything internal to a company was sort of the second thought. How do we make that happen for the customer? And that's still the same during COVID and thinking about the post-COVID transformations. But there's a lot more focus on preparing your organization for future now in such a way that it's ready to deal with unpredictability. And that's the piece that we're covering today. So if you look at the bottom piece, P1, that's where supply chain from a business and from an industry point of view comes in. So that's where we'll be focusing our conversation on how to support that customer point of view, but at the same time being mindful of structuring your company, your operations, your partners in such a way that that enables that. Now, diving into another study that I've seen from World Economic Forum, you see the link to this article at the bottom, and we'll share that with you after the session so you can read the full article as well. This chart really caught my attention. It's an interesting view where they're pointing out growth requirements. So they're calling out 5 different areas that the companies need to focus on from a perspective of enabling their future growth. And you'll notice that digital transformation is right at the center of it. So the key message there being the remote work, the workplace automation, the online services, finding partners that you can interact with using technology, all of that is becoming the center of enabling a lot of these discussions. And then at the top right-hand corner, you also see the supply chain resilience to it. So Nick, you and I were having this conversation offline on how some of these things are connected in this chart and the role that supply chain is playing on these, call it transformation or growth of a company. Would you like to comment on what you're seeing in your opinion on your clients? How are they approaching this resilience piece?
Well, this model really highlights that supply chain is how things get done. Essentially, the company strategy and the goals of the company are really achieved through the supply chain. What we're seeing right now is obviously the meat of this conversation is the challenges identified and handling the changing environment. And really, supply chain operators are very good at getting the job done. Get the boxes out the door, get the shipments out on time, in full, and up to the right place. But that resiliency and that flexibility is coming under a significant strain And that's where we get this concept of resilience and the importance of resilience into the models. So we'll go into that a little bit more detail afterwards.
Right. And what's your opinion on this pushback on globalization? I noticed that they showed that along with the trade wars at the bottom and localization as a one-way feedback into the supply chain. But to me, almost feels like that needs to be a two-way conversation, right? Your supply chain needs to be prepared for either model. So,
Exactly, and you're building it based on what you know and what you don't know, and what we don't know is what will happen with future tariffs, with trade agreements, and the decisions we make today in supply chain, whether where we put manufacturing facilities, where we source our products, have long-term impact. So it's more of the globalization. The pushback is influencing the supply chain, but the supply chain reacts to that in real time, essentially,
mhm,
because we don't have the ability to stop everything we're doing and, okay, let me reset, let me move my factories and I'll turn them back on Monday
right.
after a long weekend.
Right. And I'm just wondering now from this conversation, there's probably a big role for outsourcing to play here as well. Right. I've read a lot of articles lately, and I can't think of one, but I'll find some links afterwards and share them with the audience. There was a lot of focus on moving factories out of China and diversifying them in various locations as well. So even though there may be economies of scale in having some of those conversations, let's say in one geographic location, now there's focus on moving them to, let's say, India or some of the other areas, so you don't have the same risks popping up again from a localization point of view.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. We're seeing a lot of conversations right now around localization in terms of nearshoring and onshoring.
Right.
So companies that are looking to move production or source products closer to home to reduce the risk and the
Yeah.
length of their supply chains. So Mexico, Canada, and even in domestically into the U.S. Is a big area. I don't think that we'll be replacing China as the main source of
Right.
our manufactured goods, but I definitely think of the China plus one model as a stepping stone to enhance and to transform their supply chains to reduce that risk.
Absolutely. And if our audience have any comments, I see Gary, please go ahead, chime right in.
Yeah, I, I get a lot of feeds, and quite a lot of the feeds about this localized. They're bubbling up the localization versus keeping it extended to supply chains. I think these are decisions that companies make with the help of government in terms of quotas and tariff restrictions, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's still a company issue. But much of the commentary is converting this trading situation into a political one, like, oh, you're being protectionist, blah, blah, blah. But in the same breath as saying we ought to do more for our local people. And I think it's a really interesting kind of narrative that they can't get clear as to what they're trying to say. We want to support our own workers, I think, first. It's not anti-China or anything. It's just that in Canada, we've got a huge amount of people who are going to be made formally unemployed. We need to find work for them. And I think it's very virtuous to actually find a way in our supply chain design and our businesses to actually find a way of doing that locally. I don't know what your two views are on that.
Yeah, that's a great question or a great comment, Gary. And I when I hear that, the commentary that I've heard in the news and with conversations is that the jobs move to China. Well, the jobs don't move themselves. The countries don't take jobs. The countries and governments don't create jobs. It's the individual businesses that make the business decision to
Mhm.
move their production or source from a different locale to serve a different market. So I think the role of the government and the political role is important, but it's really about creating and setting the stage for job creation and creating the a positive business environment for the right outcome that they're trying to achieve, which is a healthier level of employment. And you're right, we need to reemploy all these people that have been impacted by COVID disruptions. But in general, we need to look at which industries are generating growth for our economy and which industries can generate jobs.
Right.
Automation won't go away. It will continue to expand. So we need to, this isn't a one-off solution. This is an ongoing adaptation to a new economy.
Yeah, actually, I'll add two things to it. So to me, you're absolutely right, Gary and Nick. There's a couple things that are actually missing on this chart. One would be from a policy point of view, right? The things that influence business decisions. Because if I look back, most of the business decisions that become trends in a particular geography are supported by the government's providing, tax shelter or whatever you want to call it, some, buffers for companies. From that point of view, the second thing would be definitely jobs, but also re-education, right? Because certain things, let's face it, just won't come back. As Nick said, automation is coming and it's probably accelerating. I can't remember, again, I would have to go back and search for the link of this article, scrolled by so many of them over the last little while. One of them actually had a graph that said, yes, the growth that technology provides is exponential, but the growth that we have seen in the last 6 months since we found out about COVID has accelerated the technology support into some of these industries by 2 years. So if it wasn't for COVID, you would not have seen the same level of progress that you've seen in the last 6 months. And you would have waited, let's say, a couple of years to see that type of progress. So some of the jobs that have been made, just no need for them anymore, unfortunately, you need to re-educate those people. So that's where the education, the universities, the courses, all of those type of industries come in as well, and how they're being supported by people who are policymakers, right? So that's the other piece that fits into this. Personally, I've seen, at least from a technology jobs point of view, jobs that can be performed remotely. I've already seen a lot of job postings coming up that say, I'm okay with this person being either in US or Canada. So there's a lot of conversations now about how that impacts those visa discussions, right? H-1B and all those things in US. But companies are already rebranding those roles that required H-1B to say, okay, well, I'm going to repost this position as a new job itself, a new role, and make it so that the person can be anywhere in North America. And that's one area where I see, instead of localization, more global trend coming up. So it's almost like a slider, right? Depending on the job role, depending on the industry where that ends up. Yeah. So any other questions or comments on this particular slide? There's a lot of information to be hashed out here, but I want to make sure we get into some exciting stuff that Nick has for us. Okay, so if not, I'll move on and we can always come back to it at the end of the conversation. So we had actually done a couple of interesting polls on LinkedIn. So we did one from a customer point of view to see how has COVID and the impact to supply chains been transferred over to the customer point of view. So this simple poll shows 3 different areas that would be visible to a customer if your supply chain is not operating optimally, or if anything has changed in it, right? So there's the prices, there's the product availability, and then there's a delivery time. And there's many other factors, but these are the 3 main ones. So Nick and I were chatting about this offline again. These are not mutually exclusive items. These are things that are interlinked. But what I'm seeing here is, at least within my network, people seem to be most bothered by the lack of product availability. So the way that I interpret this is, if I could order a product, making sure that it's available, and if I could get it from a delivery point of view within a time frame that I need it, I'm willing to pay a bit of a higher price for it. Nick, would you have any comments on how I'm interpreting that?
No, I agree. It's the opportunity is really getting the right product, and it might be a function of search,
Mm-hmm.
or lack of availability that we saw. Recent memory is really empty grocery shelves, and our focus on essentials versus non-essentials, and the challenges that those supply chains have faced. I think that was prevalent in a lot of people's memories as they went through this vote. Um, Longer lead time, we're being hammered with conversations about or messaging of same day delivery and next day delivery. Is that really a customer want and desire, or are we using it as an industry to try and differentiate or to attract more sales. It's a sales measure. Those are the two kind of areas I see as interesting
Absolutely.
results.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll also point out is looking at my personal experience, let's say from March to April timeframe when the restrictions or the emergency state was first announced in Toronto where I am, my product choosing capabilities did change a bit. So normally I would have gone, for example, for fresh fruit, but I opted for frozen fruit more, given that we were going to be in a lockdown and I wasn't sure how long that would last. So I noticed that the fresh fruit was available in grocery, but the frozen fruit was just gone. Like the third day I went there, shelves were clean. So to Nick's point, being mindful of what product people would be choosing and how to stock that. So those of you that are on call with us and didn't have a chance to participate in this poll, would you have any thoughts on how this reflects upon your experience?
If I can chip in, I wrote a recent article and it focused on what's going to be a big driver for the flight to value. One is the flight to value is a price sensitivity. People won't have so much money once the SERB's turned off and we get down to the brass tacks of being potentially unemployed or on shorter hours. But the most important thing, I think, is the raising of the availability issue. Because for the reasons that you talked about, when we went into stores searching for food to cook at home and those kind of things, and a toilet roll, etc., wasn't there. I think that's left almost an indelible print in people's minds. This is a bad thing. I only want to go into one store. No longer will I kind of browse when I'm doing my grocery from one, from a Metro to a Sobeys to a Loblaws, whatever, to get the best price. Actually, I want to go into one, so I have to put a mask on, gloves and all that kind of stuff. And I want to make sure the product is there. Pricing's perhaps less so sensitive, except that maybe I'm on a reduced budget, so I will only be able to buy so much now.
Right.
So I think availability will be absolutely key in most consumers' minds. Can I actually get it in this store, or can I get it online? So when a web store says, I've got 10, I order 5, will I actually get 5? And that's going to be a critical defining benefit of shopping with a particular banner online or in store.
Right. And Gary, do you think that geography has anything to do with that as well? Because I have a fair bit of family in India, and I could tell you that the difference in cultures and difference in just the buying power that people have probably affects that as well, right? This poll was done primarily with the North American audience. So I would just caveat that by saying that it's probably not a global view. So Nick or Gary, if you have anything to add to that.
No, nothing further from me.
I mean, I'm taking a sort of fairly North American stroke Western European kind of approach. I think that we shared very similar problems, but in the Chinese India market, their whole market dynamic is very different to what we've become accustomed to either side of the Atlantic. So I defer to your expertise in that area through your family.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just bringing the customer point of view there, right? It would be interesting to have this discussion with someone who supported supply chains in that area. And maybe that's something for another day when those folks are at the table. So Nick, there was another poll that you had done as well. Would you like to deep dive into this one, please?
Yeah, so it was just gauging the reaction from people and looking back now that we're, as we, within Canada at least, seem to be getting towards the end of the tunnel, looking back and seeing how effectively our supply chains handled all of this that was thrown at them. And I'm very glad to see that a couple of the people that responded slept like a baby each night. Your certificate of completion is in the mail. You guys did the right job, did the right work, and that is setting the stage and building the infrastructure to support the supply chain in terms of disruption and in terms of fluctuating business environments. And we've seen some significant changes.
Yeah, so sorry to jump in there, Nick. I was actually quite surprised by 29% of people pointing that out because, as we know, even Amazon, who's known for their unbreakable supply chain, so to speak, had issues with it.
They had issues, but I would say that they took action quickly,
Right.
and they made changes on the fly, and continued to perform. Here in Canada, I saw very little disruption in terms of my activity or my household activity with Amazon, and buying online, and compare that to trying to sign up for a click and collect spot from with Walmart in the first initial days of the shutdowns. There were no spots available for 7-8 days outwards. So I think some companies did a really good job, and that shows in how they are coming out of this. But I did see a couple of responses at the negative side of seeing the stresses, and in some cases also breaking completely. And these are the challenges that we've seen, especially in the food and the essential services,
Right.
essential goods. That's been an area where I think people were more concerned about the disruptions that happened, whether it be a lack of inventory, transport changes, where the air freight and container ships with cancellations resulted in longer lead times and transit times, to full out inventory failures and inability to get product out the door just because of that congestion.
Right. So once again, any lessons learned or any personal experiences that folks might have from a business point of view, please chime in.
I would suggest those people who slept each night like a baby had such a long day at work dealing with so many firefights. When they literally got into any horizontal position, they slept like a baby. Because I can't imagine any retailer, manufacturer, CPG, call it what you like, involved or non-essential, not involved immediately in the the supply chain to get stuff into stores. They were cancelling orders and shuffling things around like a crazy person. So every retailer had things going on for obvious reasons, like Loblaws, our major grocers, Walmart, Canadian Tire, Home Depot, were just responding to the change, not only the spike in demand, but the change in the mix of demand. So demand management systems were not performing particularly well. The supply chain was not performing particularly well because of the sheer disruption. So sleeping like each night like a baby was like, I've done 15 hours, I deserve some sleep.
That may be the case. So maybe they misinterpreted. Is that what you're sleeping like a baby doesn't always mean that you don't have any problems. I guess that's what you're pointing out, Gary. And I do want to just add another thing. A lot of the times when we think about supply chain, our mind automatically goes to retail. But there's other supply chains, right? So some of my clients in past have been insurance companies. Sorry, if you are on the call, please mute yourself if you're not speaking. Otherwise, you're welcome to chime in with a comment. So as I was saying, a lot of the times our mind kind of goes to the retail conversation, but thinking about some of the other areas that may not have thought about their supply chain with as much focused view in past. Insurance definitely comes to mind. And in Canada, the way the insurance business typically works is somebody either comes to your house or you meet with them for a coffee and they explain the procedure to you. They explain all the providers and then they get all your information and negotiate that, right? So that's sort of a supply chain. There's a person in the middle that helps you, an agent that helps you guide all that conversation. And that was really impacted by COVID. So a lot of people looking for insurance, let's say exploring those type of solutions because of COVID, were not able to get that service initially. And a lot of folks that I talked to in that space were really struggling. So they would probably come into either their supply chain completely broke or the smoke coming from their gears because they very quickly had to figure out how to either get on Zoom or figure out other ways to do their business. So I'll jump ahead. Nick, this is where I believe.
Before we jump on, Gary Donaghy, would you like to join in, talk a comment about Japan?
Yeah, hi there. This is, let's say, other Gary. I know, Gary with
Gary
one
with
R,
two
so this
R's.
is Gary with two R's.
There you go.
I moved to Canada about 8 months ago. I was previously working in Japan for 15 years. And on the previous slide, you mentioned about understanding that we're from Asia. So I thought I could add one point. Lastly, I was working for Walmart in the omnichannel department. And before I left, we had planned to open a new e-commerce facility in Tokyo at the end of this year. Through conversation with my former coworkers, I got to understand that the standard supply chain for the Walmart retail stores, you could say the smoke was coming from the gears. There was a lot of empty shelves, big lines, and people, especially in Tokyo, normally would do grocery shopping from day to day. So suddenly having lockdown for 2 weeks or a month had to transform shopping habits quickly.
Mhm.
And people there at home don't necessarily have the space to even store more than a week's worth of groceries. So the in-store model broke down quite badly. On the other hand, my friends told me that they were able to accelerate the fulfillment center, and it actually started operating in, I think they said in May. So it was 3 or 4 months ahead of schedule. Of course, the processes or the automation wouldn't have been installed 100%. But they said we basically have to throw any kind of available capacity at the problem, at the demand, and not make it go away, but just do something, even if it's a band-aid.
Right.
And that's how they approached it.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing, Gary.
Yeah, and I think that's very true of some Canadian retailers as well, right? I'm assuming they were not marketing stunts when the CEOs of some of these companies actually went into the stores and stocked shelves. I know some of my friends that work at companies like Loblaws and Longos mentioned that they were actually leaving their office jobs for a while from a business continuity point of view going into the stores because a shift system that came into the play really tightened how many people could be in the store. So they were trying to do whatever they could from a manual point of view. So that's a very important point. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Sure. We saw the same thing in Walmart. I think for about 2 months, a lot of my coworkers from the head office were basically transferred to any store near their home and asked to help out in any way, even if it was just cleaning and sanitizing the trolley, the car, or the basket.
Right.
So just do what you can.
Absolutely. And that's probably one area where there's been a lot of job creation, right? For better or for worse.
Yeah, that's true.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. These are the type of sharings that make these sessions really interesting, right? So now to dive into some data, Nick, over to you.
Yeah, so thanks, Gunjan. Two data points that I wanted to share with the group, which really highlight some of the major challenges that supply chains are facing today. The US publishes the Service Price Index fairly granularly for general warehousing, as well as for the LTL, FTL, and the courier industry. And we can see from comparing the rate of inflation over the past 15 years that the warehousing industry has essentially remained flat. So if you were spending $10 million for fulfillment and storage of 100,000 pallet positions, then you're spending the same amount today, essentially, which is a big challenge given that where inflation has gone. But that compares to the courier industry, so the UPSs, FedExes, and Purelators of the world that have successfully passed along annual price increases and have increased their pricing. So if you're paying $10 for a shipment in 2004, you're paying almost $24 for that same shipment and same service level. So we can see that when we consider the supply chain as a function of all of these different categories and these activities, transportation has significantly increased and continues to cost pressures on the warehousing operations have been significant. And that's where, whether it be through 3PL and outsourcing or cost reductions, margin reductions, that's been an area of constant focus to keep the pricing down. And on the next slide, is the relative e-commerce penetration. So I'll go through these two slides and we'll talk a little bit more, open to some comments. The next slide shows the e-commerce penetration compared to total retail in Canada. Just go to the next slide, Gunjan. Thank you. So, recently released Q2 numbers. Canada has shot up, and this is excluding automotive and fuel. But we've gone from 6% to over 12% of total retail is happening online. A lot of that is the significant growth in e-commerce activity, but also the reduction in the total retail. So it's been squeezed from both sides. But when we look at it, compare Canada to the US, just next. We still haven't caught up with our neighbors to the south, and continuing on into the UK and China, we see that the Canadian consumers are lagging significantly compared to our international peers. And the question becomes, are Canadian consumers significantly different in terms of expectations or activities of our online activity? I would say a lot of this we're seeing that e-commerce penetration, and what we've heard is that it's essentially been pulled forward by 3 years, 3 or 4 years. So the U.S. numbers haven't been released yet. I'm tracking from the statistical groups, StatsCan, Department of Commerce, and the various groups internationally. So the U.S. hasn't released their e-commerce numbers for Q2 yet. That'll be later next month, but I expect to see a significant increase in the U.S. Figures. The U.K. In Q2 caught up with China, over 30% of retail happening online, which is, you can see from a growth perspective, is astronomical. And from a supply chain perspective, this type of growth in such a short period of time is where we get the smoke and where the links break. Inventory become available, capacity on carriers, the ability to handle the amount of inventory on the dock and the orders without congesting everything and locking everything up. These are the big challenges that are being faced by supply chains. And you've been tracking these numbers as well, and you've talked about them through different posts on social media. Anyone have any comments or questions?
I see a comment from Yash, actually. He says that he's recently read an article saying that Five Eye countries, US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, are working on an idea of developing a stronger supply chain. Please share if you have any thoughts on this.
So I haven't read that article. I haven't heard that, but in terms of our participation and our working with clients, I know that they are trying to, as a result of COVID, find safe countries to maintain or expand international travel and international trade. One of the big challenges right now between Canada and the US is our borders are closed for non-essential travel. But transport and trade, obviously, between our two countries is critical, and that is continuing going, but it has slowed down the challenge, the flow of goods between our countries. But I'll take a look at that, Yash, and I'll see if I can get some more information for you.
Yeah, I've certainly been keeping an eye on like the developments on Brexit and within the UK, and I guess the government's intention to develop very strong links with former or current Commonwealth countries as it moves away from trading mostly, or 60% of trade with the EU. Now, on the figures of e-commerce, I was asked for my views about it. I don't know if some people caught that on my LinkedIn profile. Retail Insider, in fact, Stats Canada sent out saying it's 10%. It's never quite sure if it means 10% of bricks and mortar retail or total retail, and there's often this slight difference of opinion about how that works. But we're in the hands of a number of factors. One is I believe Amazon do not fall within the scope of Stats Canada's recording. And if they did, they would be on the e-commerce side, because most of their activity is e-commerce. It makes retailers decide what's e-commerce and what's bricks and mortar. So we're in the hands of individual retailers saying, oh, we're deciding this way this week, that way next week. And also it doesn't actually show the propensity of Canadians as a population for e-commerce, because Stats Canada records our retail sales, which could go cross-border to US or to UK or other markets, nor does it record stuff coming into Canadians cross-border into Canada, because it hasn't got a mechanism for, oh, that's a B2C piece of traffic, what's the value, let's record that and build it into a stat. So we always look a bit somewhat dumb on world markets, but we actually don't know. And typically Canadians are actually quite like forward thinking. So they're the first people, we're a great test market because we're often a test market for America, but importantly, we kind of grip new stuff. We're into gadgets and stuff. So why wouldn't our e-commerce be a lot more prevalent than the figures might suggest? It certainly over the last 3 or 4 months, many customers who always have been circumspect about sharing their details online and putting their credit card details in line. This is one of the major factors why Grocery Gateway fell over back in the early or late 90s, early 2000s, is because everything was literally cash on demand, cash on delivery rather than credit cards. But I suspect the underlying trends are actually more higher than they are, which, because we're only seeing one snippet and we're all kind of looking at that, we actually aren't paying enough attention to how big this market really is. And therefore many retailers, and I come from a retail centric point of view, I don't think we've been making sufficient infrastructure spending on this potential big piece of business that's in front of us, because we haven't really got the information to help us as retailers to say this is really very big, and we now need to, instead of bolting it onto our facilities as something that we do also or have to do, that we should be kind of saying, well, we've learned through the pandemic that if we don't have a viable online platform for a digital fulfillment system, we fail miserably. So we need to do something, but it can't be just an add-on to the distribution network as it has stood for decades.
Yeah, no, that's very insightful. And the challenge with the numbers, right? The measurement of the numbers, I've tried to be as consistent as possible through my backwards tracking, as well as comparing between countries. So removing the automotive, removing fuel. But as we've seen in the US, e-commerce is affecting the automotive industry as well. And you can now, through contactless purchase, you can buy a car without stepping foot in a dealership in that traditional model. And Tesla is one that continues to push that, where they have a showroom, but you go in and they'll just help you to a computer, and here's the website, enter your information and configure your car. So those are changing. But the other part is, from a Canadian perspective, I think there's two aspects. One is our geography. We are very much a Toronto-centric view, and I think the vast majority of the people on the call are GTA based. So we do have a heavy weighting towards the Toronto area, especially with the size of our total market. Companies that are coming in and expanding into Canada might have one facility to support all of Canada, and that will happen to be in the Toronto area, because that's where the majority of the biggest population cluster is. But as we move outside, how much of the e-commerce activity are people in the, not just secondary, but the tertiary and beyond markets of small little hamlets of 10,000, 20,000 people across Canada, which, there's still a fair bit of rural population in our country. And those distances are, from an e-commerce perspective, and we've all talked about this many times, that final mile is the most expensive part of e-commerce. So the most we can convince the consumers to go in and pick up is the most cost-effective consumption channel. But those are big challenges for supply chain operators.
Yeah, and Nick, we never know, right? I was talking to some friends that I have in Saskatchewan and some other places where you have a lot more room in between each household, right? Some people prefer to live in farm type lifestyle over there. And they've been commenting on how they've been doing a lot more online shopping now than before. So to your point, the Canadian data is definitely trending upwards because of that as well, hopefully,
Yeah.
right? Canada market might be better off.
Yeah, and one other comment to just Gary, to add on to Gary's comments was Canadian retail was also, it might be the data, but it was still growing. So there was still, a 1 to 2% growth rate for traditional retail. So to your comment of the legacy providers and the bricks and mortar companies saying, I'm still focusing on my bread and butter because it's still growing, not thinking that growth could evaporate overnight and become a non-existent market. So you're left holding the bag saying, okay, I didn't invest in e-commerce. Now I have to build that infrastructure overnight, essentially, and just make things happen. And we know in the supply chain space, I have to get the orders out the door means a lot of expediting and a lot of less cost-effective service levels.
Mm-hmm. So KW actually have a question here. How can meat conglomerates integrate more lean practices, especially in inventory, so as to reduce overhead when margins are thin? And then she says, granted, we make up for it in producing huge volumes.
And that trade-off with volume and economies of scale, it's really about understanding as a supplier and as a company the true value of inventory and finding ways to delay fulfillment until the orders are there. So being cost effective, but trying to get to that batch size of one, whether it be meat processing or retail fulfillment. That is your from a lean and a Six Sigma perspective, but your ideal state is a batch size of one. And that's a big challenge when your industry is built on economies of scale and large production runs. And I'm going to do 5,000 head per day in the processing plants, and it's just a massive production line. But that's a challenge. But there's value in delayed fulfillment, both in terms of quality of product and finding different ways to satisfy the needs. So. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think with lean, there's the other aspect, right? The capital L lean, from the point of view of Toyota, if you remember how they brought in how quickly can I move from start to finish so I don't have to hang on to my inventory in my locations for as long as I can. And that can be a double-edged sword right now, right? Because you don't know what type of unpredictabilities could come up in the system. You don't know how many finances you might have available. You don't know whether there would be a wave two or not. So from that point of view, I think it's important to look at what are your customers' deepest desires and how are they actually making decisions. And one thing I'll say is, I don't know if this helps, if you know where to look online right now, the quote unquote streets are internet right now, right? So if you know how to plug yourself into that chatter with your customer, and they don't even need to be your customers, they could be your competitors' customers who are complaining about something. I think it was Bill Gates who said at one point, if you can listen to your most complaining customer and solve that problem, they are the ones that are going to help you innovate your company. So I think it needs to be very, very focused on what specifically are their needs as opposed to just a blanket statement of, I need to increase my inventory or I need to be very lean. Because right now you can't afford to make those type of investments possibly. So you would have to be much more quote unquote capital A agile. You would need to think about what specifically do I need for what season? When are people barbecuing versus when are they looking for the dishes or the type of meat that they prefer during, let's say, holiday season? What are some of the things that they're looking at? Okay, so I know that we're at time now. And we want to thank you for your participation in this session with us. You're welcome to stay for another few minutes, Nick, if you don't mind. If anyone has any questions or comments or anything else you would like to discuss with us, I'm sharing Nick's and my contact information there with you as well if you would like to reach out to us after the session. But we'll stay online until about 1:05 if that works for you, Nick.
Yeah, that works for me as well.
Sounds great. So please feel free to unmute yourself at this point and ask away or share anything that you have experienced, whether as a customer or from a business point of view within your supply chains.
If I can get the conversation rolling while people gather their thoughts, I'm still incredibly shocked with Nick's graph of the relative price indices with, warehousing flat as a pancake. Well, what a surprise. In some ways, the proposition is being commoditized. But hang on, small package distribution is commoditized, and yet somehow they feel compelled to keep adding in more and more charges. I just wonder, the question I have for that market, all those players in it, UPS, FedEx, Purolator, etc., when will you realize, unless you innovate and collaborate, you are just, as individual organizations, about to price yourself out of the market because Amazon is coming through. And if you don't think Amazon's a competitor, trust me, you're not looking in the right area.
Yeah, well, that's a great comment. And, the commentary or the quote that's attributed to Jeff Bezos is, your margin is my opportunity. And there's a reason why Amazon is investing in the airport infrastructure, the airways, and moving goods. Here in Canada, they haven't relied as much in the major markets on the traditional couriers, and they've gone to their independent couriers a lot earlier in their supply chain journey. So the U.S. is seeing a different conversation. UPS and FedEx, as we saw, FedEx making the announcement that they were dropping Amazon as a customer last year, or seems like last year. I think it was earlier this year in reality. Is a big impact because they focus on where they're going to put their things. From a pricing perspective and the movement, your comment of seeing that growth, I think it speaks to the level of competition. The amount of investment and amount of volume in order to handle a true express courier network is very significant. And that's why we have a very few level of companies. So I think it's more of an oligopoly where there's little competition and little incentive for competition. Compared to the full truckload, which has matched CPI essentially for the last 15 years. And every truckload, every movement is essentially a new opportunity to price that truckload. So it follows the market, and it's a very much a supply and demand, because the longer that truck sits empty, is cost incurred. So the operators are incented to find the right price point to satisfy whatever demand there is for that lane that they're trying to achieve. The warehousing space, this is my perspective on why it's been flat, is there has been significant margin historically in that industry, and the opportunity for competition is continuing to grow. I can go out and rent a warehouse, might not have the credit faculty, but it'll cost me some things, but I can go set up a WMS with a cloud provider that's just as good as SAP or Oracle for a fraction of the cost. I have an incredible amount of supply chain talent available to start up new operations, to find operations managers and facility managers and supervisors. The depth of capacity and capabilities is in the Canadian market very strong. And so I have the opportunity to compete against the DHLs, the UPS supply chains, the FedEx supply chain, very effectively as a one-off provider. And the industry still has many cheap and cheerful providers that are operating. They might have 1 or 2 or 4 warehouses, and they keep their price, and they keep cannibalizing their price because it's a long-term contract, and it's cheaper to keep my existing customers than it is to find new customers to fill that 10,000 or 5,000 or 50,000 square feet. So that has continued to keep the price effectively. If you were happy 5 years ago with the price, let's renew the contract at the same price. So that's my view on this price challenge.
So one of the things that I've been wondering, Nick, I'm not sure if the critical path within the supply chains has changed due to COVID. And what I mean by that is initially you would have operationally had the same sort of model for I don't know how many years potentially, right? And there was automation making small bangs within that entire supply chain. So in your opinion, what are the different parts of supply chain from a critical path point of view that have suffered the most or have seen the most amount of change in the last little while?
I think I don't think there's an area of supply chain that hasn't been touched.
Right.
Whether it be the amount, and so interesting enough, actually, if I step back and I look at the amount of technology that's being developed and the amount of funding that's being put into the technology solution providers is astronomical compared to the valuation of the asset-based providers. You've got focus on, in the transportation space, the technology of matchmaking and finding a more efficient brokerage of capacity and demand and aggregating that customer demand to drive more efficient arbitrage of getting the trucks to do the rate. We're seeing now that expand into the on-demand warehousing in companies like Flexi that have been going and trying to create a fully virtual supply chain based on a network provider. So you're building layers on top of layers of companies doing that. Automation is another area where there's so many different opportunities and technologies out there that finding the right fit for your business is critical, but also understanding what your business is trying to accomplish. If, I've seen companies make investments in automation for e-commerce. What are your assumptions? E-commerce is growing. The last 2 months have been 100% growth year over year. We're seeing 60% growth month over month. So what assumptions do you build into your design parameters for that automation to be able to accommodate that growth? And at what point are you building either a white elephant of a massive, I expect my growth to continue at double digits for the next 12 months? Well, that is a massive investment compared to where you are today. And conversely, if you don't take into account growth, then how do you handle the N+1 orders that come into your system once you've reached capacity? Because automation is trading flexibility for certainty.
Right.
I can pump through 5,000 orders per hour, but don't give me 5,001. It'll slow everything down.
That's a great response. So I do have another question from Gary D. I don't want to pronounce the name wrong. Gary, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure. Hi. Guess it's a question for Nick and maybe other Gary, but I got to be familiar with the model of Uber Freight in the US back in 2018. Are you both familiar with that system or that model? As you were talking about the way that packages, Purolator, FedEx, UPS, and Amazon are handling the market in Canada, I wondered if you think the kind of driver, truck, and trailer as a commodity or like being available on demand, do you think that model is the way to move forward, especially in Canada?
Well, I actually take a different approach to that. I don't think that's any different than it has been for the last 30 years. The transportation industry, the trucking industry has always been a commodity business where someone is always willing to do it cheaper because they have to get the truck back. And they'd rather put a little bit of freight on there rather than drive empty. So I don't see Uber Freight as being truly as transformational as they say to be or perceived to be. They have some better technology, and they're able to match the supply and demand in different ways. But I don't see it as being any different than what has already been the industry norm for the past 30 years. So I think they are bringing attention. They're bringing a lot of investor capital to innovate and to drive technology. And I think that's where the technology is a big growth and a big step forward to allow companies to be more efficient, especially in the transportation space where lane-based, asset-based providers are focused on their one lane, but you're trying to aggregate customer demand and being a solution to everyone, whether it be a freight broker or not. The old model was really telephone-based and email-based, and we're still an industry based on EDI integrations, which are from the 60s. So technology innovation is good. I don't think the Uber Freight model is any different in terms of being an on-demand or technology-based matching service. I think it's just it's a better branding and a little bit more efficient.
I happen to agree completely with what you're saying. I think that we, looking at Uber Freight as if it's going to be transformational as Uber Taxi was. Uber entering into a taxi market was transformational because it actually brought a different set of circumstances, a different resource pool to be able to, for consumers to benefit from a different way of doing things. Uber Freight, as very much as Nick has said, is just perhaps a more transparent, more visible way of finding other loads that my dispatcher couldn't dial quick enough to find that load to get it onto the back of a truck to bring it back. So I think the only thing it does potentially provide is just a little bit more visibility. And there may be some other commercial scheme about peaking and troughing kind of pricing to help things along. But I think it's almost a continuous improvement project rather than a transformational project. I'd rank it in the former of those two.
Yeah.
So Nick sorry, go ahead, Nick. Sorry,
that is transformational from a transportation industry is the automated trucking. Automation and essentially removing the driver from the equation has the opportunity to significantly transform the industry in ways that I don't think we can even begin to comprehend. This could have huge impacts on cross-border freight. It could have huge impacts on other activities. So I think automation and the autonomous trucking, which I would say is probably feasible in the next 5 years. I'd say in the near term. I don't think it's in the next year or so that we're going to have truly autonomous, but technology is continuing to expand, and there's a lot of investment and a lot of R&D happening in that space. So I think that's where a true transformation is going to happen. Could even be, bringing back private fleets. People could look at, buying an autonomous truck in a different lens now, rather than having their own fleet and worrying about drivers and driver retention and all that. Now you have a fully autonomous, it's another computer.
And I would just go one step further, and I see different bits of technology being developed. I think Walmart were setting up 10 big DCs to feed their, in the US, to feed their 42 RDCs. So suppliers would bring it into the 10, but they were bringing it into the 10 or moving it between the 10 and the 42 with self-loading and self-unloading trailers. Now my thought on this, and I do actually follow Brett and Ladd's concept on this, and who got their first meal in, I don't know, but is to actually take the truck out of the equation, because many people think, oh, we just won't have a bloke in the truck. As both of us say, why have a truck? And if you want a great sort of like a graphic example of that, I think it was in one of the Avenger films, sorry for being a bit trivial about this, but in the background were these just trailers up and down this highway. And I thought that's exactly what we should be looking at. These people don't, these trailers, don't worry about the Stanley Cup. They don't turn up late for work. They don't have fits and laziness. They don't get obese. They don't, come to the end of their working life. They just run. And if they can load and self-unload, we've basically potentially organized the kind of primary distribution from a supplier in bulk into a distribution network, or from a distribution starting point, a primary consolidation center, into a distribution network. Those things, truckloads, we should be thinking very clearly about trailers, automated trailers, and deal with take the truck out. For the tertiary distribution from the DC to the store, that may need a truck with the option of putting a driver in there for complicated runs or near like yard work. But I think for the A to B, pin to pin work, definitely trailers only. That's just my view.
And I completely agree with you. I was actually just thinking about this. We probably need another session to talk about how technology and the lean aspect of things will affect supply chain. So we're grossly over time now. So I really want to thank everybody for sticking with us this long. And I hate to cut the discussion short, but I recognize the need for you to return to your day job here as well. I want to thank you all for, again, sharing your lunch hour with us, and for the two Garys, Nick, KW, everybody for participating in this conversation with us. We will be in touch with you when we're planning our next conversation, and hopefully Gary will have you participating in the next one as well to share your knowledge with us.
Excellent. It's been a great conversation. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely. Have a great long weekend, everyone. And just a quick note that we do have another session coming up with TED Circles, actually, change versus transformation. This one isn't really so much focused on supply chain, but in general, what actually leads to companies from a simple change to a transformational change. So looking forward to seeing some of you there as well. So again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful long weekend and stay in touch. Take care.